Hello, my name's Simone. Thank you so much for including me on the program. Really excited to be joining you. So I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, which is also the stolen country of the Indigenous owners of the country. The city I'm joining on is part of the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. As I said, thanks again for including me in this conference. I'm looking forward to having conversations when we all meet virtually online. Today I'm going to run through some slides for a presentation that I prepared based on some research that I undertook as part of my PhD in the 2013 to about 2015, which I recently had published in the Journal of Sociology. I'm going to update the findings of that journal a little bit in light of some recent social policy developments in Australia that are relevant to that research. So without further ado, I'll just share my slides. Yeah, so as I mentioned, my research was about single mothers and resistance to welfare to work. And I took a Bourdieusian, a social theoretical approach to the analysis that I undertook for that research, and I'll explain what benefits that added. But first of all, I'm going to just briefly talk you through some of the social policy settings in Australia that have been affecting single mothers. So over the last 20 years, or even longer, Australia has, like many OECD countries, transitioned to a work-first model of welfare to work rather than an investment approach. And that's enforced by imposing activity tests on people, underwritten by a system of financial sanctions if people don't comply with those requirements. We use the idea of mutual obligation in Australia, and it's based on a contractarian attitudes to welfare informed by the great paternalists, Lawrence Mead and Charles Murray. And the particular phases of welfare to work social policy implementation I'm referring to are the welfare to work reforms which activated single parents starting in 2008 and then again in 2013. So when I undertook my research, at the outset, I identified a number of issues that I thought were important to interrogate. And what I was seeing, and at the time I was actually working as a policy advisor for a sort of industry body for the not-for-profit employment services providers. And so what I'd actually seen from my work was that there was quite a lot of conflict at the street level in employment services. And I was keen to kind of find out what was causing that. I'd also noticed that social policy, in my view, was being particularly badly designed, and that there was a high level of disengagement from the people of the people who the services were supposed to be helping. And I saw this as a waste of agency resources, and also it led to quite a lot of worker burnout. So, I was very interested in the idea that social policy was not actually improving economic participation, and that it was a very inefficient social and public policy system here in Australia. And there was a lot of bad reputation and bad management associated with that had received quite a bit of media exposure. So as part of a broader study, the study that I undertook with single parents was actually framed in terms of a gap in existing research where there was room to explore the causes of conflict and resistance in employment services. So it was a small-scale qualitative study with purposive recruitment. I didn't actually set out to interview quite as many single parents as I did, but it just turned out that the research coincided with a change in social policy settings for single mothers in particular, and that was why I was able to recruit a sizable cohort of single mothers for the research. And in the interviews, I asked the participants to reconstruct incidents involving threat of sanction. And I saw those incidents of threat of sanction as important because they are the moment that the power of the state is reinforced in street level interactions. So where people are reminded that if they don't do what they are being told to do, or if what they're being coerced to do, that they will forego the means of their survival through financial sanctions. And so once the interviews were undertaken, I undertook abductive analysis and I used that to inform the development of my own theory about this street level conflict. So as I mentioned before, I had a critical orientation on which was informed by Bourdieu's theory of practice, and I saw the conflict that was occurring at the street level and employment services as a social mediation related to welfare distributions. And in order to understand how people were able to exercise resistance in those contexts, I needed to have a theory of agency as well as a theory of structure that showed the enabling capabilities of individuals within the constraints of the broader social system. So I found that Bourdieu's theory of practice and the field analysis aspects of that were quite useful for understanding the forms of resistance that I identified in the analysis, and that Bourdieu's theory of practice, the concepts of habitus, field and capital were useful for understanding how resistance could be practiced. But I also had an overlay of the role of interests informing the way that people acted within the field that they acted. So in Bourdieu's broader theory of practice, there's also some theory relating to cultural reproduction, in which cultural reproduction and change, social change are posited as conflicts over interests within some dominating frameworks. And I saw agent behaviour being driven by their attachments to interests. And in the case of single parents, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And I also construed individual agents as being capable of reflective analysis and having cognitive agency, which was not the same idea as habitus. So the properties of fields in Bourdieu's theory of practice are that they have objective as well as subjective properties. They have the instrumental properties of fields are expressed in documents like rules and laws, and they provide overt limits on controls on behaviour and action. There's also practice conditions, which means that the rules of every field are reenacted as people participate in those fields as if they were playing a game which they tacitly knew the rules of. And in the Bourdieu's theory of practice, the ideas of intersubjectivity and recognition are really important in terms of how we interact with others and perceive, what their roles are within the games that we're playing in fields of action. And the idea of recognition is related to the validation of interests, in the sense that if somebody's interests are validated within a field, they receive more recognition within it. And the idea of interest was actually a relatively late insertion into Bourdieu's theory of practice. So in my version of the theory, I saw that there was people were undertaking things from an interest-based perspective, and that was consistent with the idea that agents are, the position that agents, individuals, take within a field is dependent on their structural position within the field. And Bourdieu identified interest as an attachment actors have to the stake in a game. As you can see, there's a quote here from Bourdieu about how he conceived interest to inform people's action in fields. And so in conclusion on this theoretical element of the research, I conceived of actors having interests in fields, at the stake that actors have in a field as being reflected in the interest that they had in that field. So in my research, as I interviewed 6 single mothers, as it turned out, I saw that they had been kind of activated in 2 ways. First of all, the social policy settings had changed, and therefore they were being activated to participate in welfare to work reform policies, which meant that they suddenly had to start looking for a job, face sanctions if they didn't do what they were being told to do, and that they also, there was coinciding with that was a reduction in their welfare payments. And all of these things together were supposed to provide incentive for them to actually get a job. So the second type of activation then was this sense of having been kind of reclassified in the process of the implementation of the welfare to work reforms. And that reclassification actually led to quite a lot of sense of personal injustice. And in my view, it actually was a motivating factor in the single parents participating in the research that I was advertising at that time, but also for them to actually start to work together to collectivise, to resist the forms of social policy to which they were being subjected. So in the analysis that I did on the forms of resistance that were practiced within the welfare to work field by the single mothers, I identified the fact that they were, organised around their shared interest, which was the interest in the field they had as single parents affected by the welfare to work reforms. And not only did they undertake personal forms of resistance, which are the forms of everyday resistance that Scott has written about, and which, is drawn on as one of the theories of resistance that, everyday resistance that are discussed in other researchers. So they were definitely tactics of the poor and weapons of the weak that the single mothers were practicing, in their everyday encounters with the structures of welfare to work. But they were also engaging in forms of interpersonal resistance, discursive resistance, so rejecting the stereotypes that were being imposed on them, and not only just in discussion with me in the research, but they were going around every day trying to subvert these subjective interpretations of them as single mothers, and they're associated with that the idea that they were welfare dependent and inactive. And there was very strong resistance to this discursive construal of them and association with them of being welfare dependent. Then the other aspect of resistance I identified in research was political resistance. And this was where the mothers started to join groups, especially social media groups, and work together to share resources and support, but also to start up a social movement. And also at one stage, there was some work towards setting up a single parents action group and going into registering that as a political party in a federal election that was going to be held. So on the screen here, I've just shared some examples of the forms of resistance that I identified. So in this case, I call this as an instrumental form of resistance, in which a single mother went in and cancelled her payments because she didn't want to be subjected to all the rules and so on. That meant she wasn't able to spend as much time parenting as she had wanted to. And then discursive resistance, as I mentioned, this is about trying to subvert other people's attitudes, trying to subvert forms of intersubjective recognition that we're all conscious that people make judgments about us. And so I noticed, there were actions that the single mothers took to actually subvert that, such as changing the way they were dressed, from sort of everyday clothes to wearing an office outfit to an interview at a job agency. And, I also saw quite a lot of misrecognition in the research, which was where, as I said before, the parents identified people as seeing them as welfare dependent and not being able to cope. And that caused people a sense of great harm. And these are the kinds of harms that Bourdieu identified in the idea of symbolic violence. So in terms of collectivization, the mothers, as I said, started to participate in, social media sites. One of those was a blog that I kept on the research that I was undertaking, that I was sharing in social media and, getting some comment from other parents. And at the time, there was a very strong sense of single mothers coming together to resist the welfare to work reforms. I am also a single mother, and at that time I felt that great sense of injustice being inflicted on other mothers, although at the time I was working, and I was working also in an industry body for employment services. So this is just an example of one of the parents who contacted me saying, I thought I was on my own. But, when I found your research, I found your blog, I realised that I wasn't on my own. And, there was a great sense of support and relief the single mothers had in finding each other in this way. So in the research, I also identified that this coming together was something that the single mothers were initiating themselves, and they had their own views about how social change might occur as a result of their collectivization, and some of the single mothers had been going to the media. So just to summarize how Bourdieu's theory of practice applied to the research, in the end, I read some more of theory around Bourdieu's, the adaptation of Bourdieu's theory to social movement theory, and I came across some readings by someone called Husserl, whose references will be at the end of this slide pack that I'll share with you. So the theory of practice allows for structural openings in fields that are consistent with political process theory. So a structural opening, it can occur as a result of a social policy reclassification. And that's really what did happen in the case of the single mothers that I interviewed for my research. And within that, the field, it's structured that the positions that people take within the field are actually dependent on where they were kind of set up in the field and what state they had in the field. So single parents had been in a certain position in the welfare to work field until they were activated. Their position was kind of changed by that activation, as I've mentioned. And so I saw very much the case that the parents have been affected by a reclassification and the sense of misrecognition and injustice that went along with that. And that was consistent with resource mobilization theory, which is one of the social movement theories, where interest is seen as a common denominator in forms of resistance, and that the conversion to collectivization is driven by the denial of legitimacy of people's roles in society or in a field, as was the case with the single mothers, and that actors seek to influence and change the conditions of the field, and that they collectivise using social and cultural capital. And in the era that I undertook my research, social media was very definitely enabling that collectivisation. So I just wanted to talk you through some of the more recent developments in Australia. There's been a government program called Parents Next, which was introduced in 2018. So after when I initially undertook my research, it had been in a pilot, but it was expanded nationally in 2018, and it targeted single mothers with children as young as 9 months. It was intended to be a pre-employment program, so that parents, mainly single mothers, who had not been working before they had children, could get some support to, you know, think about what they might do in terms of paid employment when their children reach school age. But it became a mandatory program, and so once you were activated by the Parents Next rules, you had to participate in the program, or else you would face financial sanctions, so you could have your payment cancelled. And the program was also targeted at a large number of communities where there were higher numbers of people who were Indigenous, or from a culturally and linguistically diverse program. And at the outset, as the program was introduced and implemented, it resulted in large numbers of single mothers having their payments suspended because they weren't actually meeting the rules of the program, and this received quite a lot of press. There was also quite a lot of concern at the, as I mentioned before, I was working at an industry body at that time, and the agencies delivering the program were themselves quite concerned about the extent of payment suspensions that women, single mothers who were participating in the program were experiencing because of the program. And there were a lot of issues that the providers themselves were trying to resolve to stop that happening. And all of this compliance for the program, as in taking people's payment away if they weren't doing what they were supposed to according to the program rules, was actually detracting from the program benefits intent, so that it wasn't actually achieving any of the social policy goals that it was intended to, which, as I said before, was supposed to help, you know, people who had children who hadn't been working to figure out what they were going to do when the children reached school age. So it was a bit of a social policy fiasco, actually. There was a lot of media and engagement in terms of the issues that were being caused. And this led to a Senate inquiry, and just recently there was a human rights inquiry as well. It also led to the collectivisation of mothers in a Parents Against Parents Next Facebook group that's been facilitated by one of the most vocal advocates about the program at that stage, who has played an active role in trying to get the media interest in this, as I have done as well, and who has been there every step of the way as we've tried to get the program abolished. So far to date, we haven't had a great deal of success in actually getting it abolished, but we have raised the profile about the program. And as I said, there has been a human rights inquiry into whether the program is justified and whether it results in more benefits than harms. And the human rights inquiry actually found that the program was harmful and suggested that it be abolished, but that wasn't actually acted on by the government that we have in Australia today. If there's a change of government, it's quite likely the program will be abolished and replaced by something that is not compulsory, that is voluntary. So all this activity around Parents Next, it actually aligns with my own theoretisation of the way that social policy fields can change, and that this and the resistance that arise in those contexts are a reaction to domination, and they lead to forms of resistance that are enacted at both personal, interpersonal and political levels. And also it showed the extent to which human actors are capable of reflective analysis and influencing social change, and also the extent to which policymaking agencies and actors are motivated to change field conditions to align with their interests so that they become the dominant interests of the field. We're not there yet in Australia on welfare to work measures for single mothers, but there's certainly a lot of activity going on in that space. So the findings of the research that I undertook with single mothers do have some implications for understanding how social policy reclassifications can seed social movements, particularly when they're related to changes in the access to welfare and the effects that these has on economic well-being. that the concepts from Bourdieu's theory of practice around capital recognition interests are all relevant to understanding resistances and social movements, and that you can use the theory of practice to identify the conversion process from individual forms of resistance to collective forms of resistance. Final slide is the references that I'm sure will be sent around in the slide pack. So once again, thank you so much for enabling me to join this conference today, and I look forward to having more conversations with you face-to-face virtually later on. Thank you.